The ruthless and cynical world of the illegal dog trade is exposed. How can puppies and potential owners be protected? The pictures of puppies being bred in appalling conditions have shocked viewers as the authorities are urged to tackle a sickening trade.
We have dogs being produced on a massive scale, on an industrial scale, and being sold for enormous profits. When you take that and you spread it across the whole of the UK, we are looking genuinely at a multi-million-pound business.
And the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act. Opposition parties want it repealed and accuse the SNP of passing it in their bulldozer years. We'll debate how the problem could be addressed instead. Good evening. Tonight, a BBC Scotland investigation reveals the shocking conditions inside licensed puppy farms as dogs are bred on an industrial scale. It's a multi-million-pounds business which has devastating consequences for many dogs' lives. In a moment, we'll speak to a leading vet and a legal expert on how to stamp out the trade. But first, here's Samantha Poling with her investigation.
What you're watching is an illegal dog deal. The woman is paying her supplier for a consignment of pups. Almost every week they meet, sometimes in Belfast, other times this abandoned fish factory near Kenryan. And each time numerous pups are transferred from the van into the waiting car. They're then sold as family pets from this home in Coatbridge.
Hiya, have I got the right place for the Puggles? Come on, top man, thank you. How are you doing?
This is Noel Smith.
Hi. Hiya, hi.
And this is his wife, Dawn.
Hey, this is Puppy.
Hello.
So how many were in the litter?
5.
5, okay.
Is there any other pups at all, or is this the only one that's left?
Last one.
So these are your friends?
You've been breeding them for a long time?
Oh, we've just got our dog, and then because he's a daughter, she's just started breeding her. That's her first litter.
Right, got you. Right.
So they're just used to the kids running about.
We also managed to capture on camera their latest deception tactic, the transfer of adult female dogs, which they'll later pass off as being the mother to some of the pups.
They're transporting dogs that they call show bitches, a dog that they can show as a bitch, and they'll pass that dog off as being the mother of the pups that they bring. Every step we make to combat the activities they do, they then change their activities to second guess us.
Official advice is always asked to see the mother. This should be one way of proving your pup isn't from a puppy farm. But Dawn Smith is ready with an answer for our undercover team.
Is the mum about at all? Or
My daughter's actually took the mum to the caravan.
Ah, right, okay.
The mum here?
I've not got the mum here. She's away because the pups were feeding on her.
If I wanted to come and see the mum with them, I could possibly do that or not?
If they're still here.
Yeah.
What was Mum?
Mum's the Cavalier.
Mum's the Cavalier.
Dad's Bichon.
Are you the breeder as well?
Yes.
Such are the profits to be made in the dog trade that the scale of some breeding businesses is now causing animal welfare agencies serious concern. We filmed this puppy farm in the Republic of Ireland. Inside one barn, a growing room. These boxes, we're told, are illegal. Many of the pups inside them bound for the UK market.
This is a water system, okay? So these are being used in exactly the same way that you would guinea pigs or rabbits. I mean, if that heat lamp is only on because this bitch in here is having pups now. This one next door to it has got no heat lamp, the roof of it is slid over, there's nothing. There are no air holes. Its only contact with the outside world, literally, is that water bottle here, going right into the side of this.
The Scottish SPCA is now leading a multi-agency operation to tackle the trade. Its plan is to disrupt where possible, turning dog smugglers back at the ports and raiding those they suspect of having trafficked them into the country.
Police!
And a new task force has been set up to target those dealing illegally in dogs.
We have dogs being produced on a massive scale, on an industrial scale, and being sold for enormous profits. Our investigations to date have identified a number of individuals and groups of individuals who are earning hundreds of thousands of pounds per year doing this. When you take that and you spread it across the whole of the UK, we are looking genuinely at a multi-million-pound business.
It's that big?
It is absolutely that big.
There are now growing calls for a change in animal welfare legislation to further protect those we used to consider man's best friend.
Well, join me now from our Aberdeen studio is Mike Radford from the University of Aberdeen, and in our Brighton studio is the vet and animal welfare campaigner Mark Abraham. Good evening to both of you. Thanks for joining me. First of all, to you in Aberdeen, Mike, where do we stand with the law in Scotland when it comes to these breeders and dealers, and how can they start to feel the full force of the law so something can be done to tackle this illegal trade?
The law needs urgent reform. What is clear is that the present legislation in relation to dog breeders and pet shops is no longer fit for purpose, and we need urgent action by the Scottish Parliament to address this problem.
So what kind of things would you like to see being done? And I suppose we're hearing from Revenue and Customs, and perhaps these are the people who can, at the moment, really go after the dealers and the breeders after all that money that they take in.
Well, clearly the breeders are in this trade to make money, and this is all cash in hand and is not being declared to the revenue, so their involvement is important. But also we need much more up-to-date, much more demanding legislation with contemporary standards. And the two things that I would argue for are, first of all, much greater transparency, so that owners and potential purchasers can trace back where these animals are coming from, and secondly, along with transparency, traceability.
Mark Abraham, I see you agreeing with that final point on greater transparency, because of course, when you look at it, I mean, a lot of these breeders are actually licensed.
Who's that? Is that to me or Mike?
To you, Mark. In Brighton.
Okay, good evening, Mike. We couldn't be further apart, Aberdeen and Brighton. Yes, you know, I have to echo what Mike says. It's absolutely right. We need greater transparency, greater traceability, greater accountability, really. And what that means is we've got to get rid of the third-party puppy trade. We've got to get rid of the dealers. We've got to get rid of the pet shops. We've got to get rid of anyone that sells without the mum. Because if mum's not there, the puppy's probably been bred on a puppy farm. So the solution is for people to go directly to the breeder and see the mum interacting with the pup. And this is the difference with the fake mums or the show bitches or whatever you want to call them. There's no interaction with the puppies. A mum of a pup is clearly interacting with that pup. Or, of course, the other alternative is to go to a rescue centre. You know, there's plenty of rescue dogs, including puppies, that desperately need loving forever homes, most of which are microchipped and house-trained and even neutered. So what are people doing, spending thousands of pounds on dogs that they don't even know where they come from, when they can go to the local rescue centre and pick up a bargain and have a lot more love?
So on that point, Mark, do you think we, the general public, are in some way responsible for what's happening here? Because we, the general public, are looking for these particular breeds?
Well, in a way we are, but you can't blame the public, because the legislation allows the public to think that everything's okay. You know, if you walk into a pet shop, which still sells puppies, the pet shop will tell you it's licensed, it's regulated, it's inspected. They're absolutely right. They'll also tell you that they're getting their puppies from a licensed dog breeder. They're absolutely right. The whole trade is legitimate. The puppy dealing trade is legitimate. So the public who think, hang on a minute, that can't be right, go, well, if it's legal, it must be okay. The sale of third-party puppies without their mum is a wrong activity. It's like smoking in a pub. It's like driving without a seatbelt. It's wrong.
Right.
It's been proven countless times by scientific papers. We need to ban it. We need to go to the breeder or to rescue centre.
Mike Radford, it is very difficult for the general public when looking for a dog to actually hear that these licensed breeders are actually doing something wrong when they're licensed.
Indeed. Indeed. There needs to be much more effective enforcement by local authorities, and also things like selling puppies in pet shops, in my view, should be banned outright. It's an absolute nonsense that all the scientific advice, including from the government, says never buy a puppy without seeing the mother with it, and yet it is quite legal for a licensed pet shop to sell puppies without the mother there. That is quite clearly unacceptable. The other issue is that, in my view, the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament have missed a trick. They have, and this is very welcome, introduced compulsory microchipping of dogs very recently. But the primary reason for that is to reunite lost dogs with their owners. Now, that's a very good thing, but as these dogs are microchipped, this is the method by which they could be traced back. At the moment, the microchipping regime matches dog with owner. It could and should be used to also trace back the backstory of this dog,
right,
where it has come from.
So, Mark, in Brighton, what would your advice be to someone who is looking to purchase a dog but wants to avoid all these horrific pitfalls?
Well, it's quite clear. First of all, if you want to choose a dog or puppy, you go to a rescue centre. If you're dead set on getting a puppy for whatever reason, which is fine, it has to be responsibly bred. You have to see it interacting with its mum. So you go to a responsible breeder, you do your research, even ask at your local vets. So it is possible to make the responsible decision. I'd also like to thank Sam Poling and BBC Scotland for making this documentary tonight. It was incredibly brave, and it's a bit of a game changer, really, and an eye-opener to say that the third-party trade is bad. And I'd also like to thank some of the SNP MPs that are working very, very closely with me, particularly Paul Moynihan, who are doing some fantastic work with me in Westminster to try and change legislation. So a big shout out to those guys.
Mark Abraham in Brighton and Mike Radford in Aberdeen, thank you both very much for joining me. Now, the final whistle could soon be called in the controversial piece of legislation aimed at tackling sectarianism. Alex Salmond's SNP administration passed the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act. It aimed to criminalise offensive and threatening behaviour, including sectarianism related to football matches. But in the new look Holyrood, opposition parties are now eyeing up their chances, hoping they can repeal a law which they've called unfair and unworkable. Here's Suzanne Allen.
Jack McConnell called it Scotland's secret shame. As First Minister, he drove anti-sectarian initiatives and had it top of the political agenda. In 2012, an Offensive Behaviour at Football Act was passed by a majority SNP administration. Many groups and political parties said it wasn't necessary, that laws that already existed were good enough. Yesterday, speaking on the Sunday Politics programme, Patrick Harvey of the Greens said there was a groundswell of opinion to have elements of the Act repealed. How that's done is open to debate.
Well, there are two parts of that legislation. The offensive behaviour football stuff has been the most high profile and contentious, and I would basically like to see that gone, an alternative approach to dealing with sectarianism that would be more effective. But there's also the threatening communication stuff, and although I have problems with it, I think that should be amended rather than repealed.
Today, here at the Sheriff Court in Glasgow, a 26-year-old man was given a year-long ban from football for shouting offensive remarks at a game. There's no doubt this is a controversial piece of legislation. The Police Federation, who represent rank-and-file officers, say it's not up to them to come up with the law, only to implement it. But there's no doubt people are telling them they enjoy football an awful lot more. So what's wrong with a law that sounds good in its intention? This woman stood as a candidate for the Rise Party in this year's Scottish elections. She's heard anecdotal evidence from fans who say they've been mistreated.
It's pretty harrowing stuff. Whilst the conviction rates under the OBA might be low, the disruption to people's lives just can't be underestimated. We cite examples of banners and scarves and flags that have the picture of Che Guevara on it being confiscated as, potentially offensive under this Act.
It was supposed to curb sectarian chanting, singing and offensive tweets. With 79 convictions for the year 2014 to 15, critics claim it doesn't. The Scottish Government say that public opinion is broadly in favour of the law. Research suggests 88% of Scots identify football as a contributing factor to sectarianism. But is it on the wane anyway?
Really is, to me, fascinating that when sectarianism, overt and vicious sectarianism, is in its death throes, that we have A, anti-sectarian charities, and B, this very heavy-handed legislation. So it's a kind of what you would call a paradox.
Now with the SNP no longer having a majority and the other parties in theory for reforming the Act, could it really happen?
Joining me now is John Mason from the SNP, and in our Aberdeen studio is the Scottish Conservatives, Alex Johnson. Good evening to both of you. Alex Johnson, first of all, what problems do you have with this legislation, and do you differentiate between the two parts, as Patrick Harvey was pointing out, offensive behaviour and threatening communication?
I think that what we have to remember here is that the law, in my view, was actually adequate to deal with these problems prior to this piece of legislation. And what we have is the kind of legislation which has always been seen to be bad, and that is reaction to events. What we had was a desire by the High Hegion, the First Minister of the time, to do something about it, and he sent civil servants scurrying round in circles to try and bring some legislation together. And what we ended up with is something that is certainly no better than what we had before, and may actually have caused more problems than the previous legislation did.
But the Scottish Government say now that any move to repeal it would send the wrong signal.
I think what we need to encourage is people to take a responsible attitude towards the way they behave in public. And I believe that this legislation has in some cases actually caused more trouble than it's saved. And as a result, I think we should have a more mature, a more human approach to this. And this legislation has had its chance and it hasn't worked.
Right. John Mason from the SNP. You hear what Alex Johnson is saying. You hear what the other opposition parties are saying. You hear what the fans have said too. This looks like it's on the way out now.
Well, I think, first of all, a very small number of fans, because you saw the figures there. I think 88% of the public supporting it, majority of Rangers supporters supporting it, majority of Celtic supporters supporting it. And when you say to people, are you happy with sectarianism in Glasgow and the west of Scotland? People are not happy with that. People want sectarianism dealt with. So what Alex Johnson and others have got to remember is, if this Act was repealed, we would be saying that sectarianism is acceptable, anti-Catholicism is acceptable, and anti-Irish racism is acceptable. And as far as I'm concerned, none of these are acceptable.
But these people are not saying that, but what they're saying is, as one sheriff said, this is deeply flawed legislation.
Well, one sheriff may have said that, but others have supported it. The police have largely supported it, and football fans generally. I go to football, all of us behave that bit worse at football games, and there's a small number of people at most clubs where the behaviour is just way, way over the top and needs to be curbed. So clearly football is one of the areas. It's not the only area. We also need to look at education. We need to look at culture. There's many ways of dealing with this, but I do think that this legislation is part of it.
So, Alex Johnson, you may want to get rid of it, but what are you saying constructively to have in its place?
Well, what I'm saying is that aggressive sectarian behaviour was illegal before this legislation came about, and it will be illegal after this legislation has been repealed. What we need to do is encourage people to take a more responsible attitude, and what this legislation has done is actually built up aggravation between the law enforcement and some football supporters, and that's the opposite of what it was meant to do.
But did it not give police an extra tool to deal adequately with sectarianism?
It gave police one more tool, but what it also did was manufactured situations where there was aggression between the police and football supporters, which was simply caused by this legislation. And that's in situations where the kind of aggressive behaviour that the bill was designed to cope with was already illegal prior to this legislation being put on the books.
John...
Now, what we can do What we should have done is simply used existing legislation, such as breach of the peace, to prosecute people who behaved in an intimidating manner in public places.
But that legislation was not working. Breach of the peace is far too vague. The courts don't like it.
But the point Mr Johnson was making, that this has eroded fans' confidence in the police. It's led to the two sides coming up against each other like that.
I don't accept that. I mean, there's a small number of fans, and I see it on Twitter and Facebook and so on, who will be against the police no matter what. They see the police as a bad thing. But I think the majority of people, certainly in my constituency, and I think Glasgow and the west of Scotland, really feel we need to deal with sectarianism. For too long we've just been not prepared to talk about it, and we need to talk about it. Now, if Alec Johnson or others want to put a better piece of legislation, or if they want to improve this legislation, well, let's talk about it. But to remove the legislation just sends out totally the wrong signal.
So in a word, finally, Alex Johnson, will you work with the other parties then to outvote the SNP in this?
Yes, we will. We wanted to talk about it when this legislation was being railroaded through Parliament with an SNP majority. They want to talk about it now that the majority is gone. That's unacceptable. We need to do something about this piece of outdated and inappropriate
we'll see what happens. Alex Johnson, John Mason, thank you both very much for joining me. Thank you. Tomorrow, Holyrood will select their nominee for First Minister, but in Wales, there's a deadlock over their next First Minister. Talks have been ongoing after extraordinary post-election scenes last Wednesday. Plaid Cymru's Leanne Wood and Labour's Carwyn Jones were tied 29-29 in a vote. Earlier, the political editor of BBC Wales, Nick Cervini, spoke to me from Cardiff. Nick, first of all, can you give us an update on what's happening tonight?
Well, the discussions between Labour and Plaid Cymru have come to an end. We've had a statement late this afternoon, and they're saying they're pleased with the progress that has been made. Now, the next step is that tomorrow morning, both Labour and Plaid will present these proposals to their respective groups in the Assembly. And in the statement that we've got, it's what they're saying is the clear anticipation is that the nomination of the next First Minister of Wales will happen on Wednesday this week, and presumably without the drama of the previous week, and that will in effect then set in motion a sequence of events that will allow a Labour minority administration and a cabinet to be formed by the end of the week.
Now, you speak about the drama of the previous week. It's been quite a debacle, hasn't it?
Oh, it has. The nomination of the First Minister was expected to be a formality by many people. And what happened was that Carwyn Jones, as expected, was nominated for Labour. They are by far the biggest party with 29 seats. But Plaid Cymru nominated their leader, Leanne Wood. And the crucial point here is that they had the support of the Conservatives and UKIP, which meant that it ended up with a dead heat of 29 all. The reason they did that is that Plaid had gone to Labour and said, look, we need another week. We need more time to discuss any potential deals before we have this nomination. But Labour refused to do that. As a result, then, Plaid nominated Leanne Wood. We ended up with a dead heat. The whole thing was adjourned. And we've ended up with these discussions between Labour and Plaid Cymru to try to break the deadlock. And in the middle of all of this, Labour have been prevented from forming a new government, and Carwyn Jones has been prevented from becoming the next First Minister of Wales.
And just very briefly, Nick, what does this mean for the Labour Party in Wales?
Well, there's no doubt that the opposition parties really wanted to give Labour a bloody nose during this process. I think the opposition parties will clearly feel that they've given Labour a fright. I have to say, in terms of the tone from Welsh Labour, it was pretty conciliatory. I think they were, in effect, saying, yeah, they got it. They got the opposition that they'd felt. And up until this point, they are saying they're going to work closely with Plaid to try to work a way through it. But I have to say, behind the scenes, there has been a lot of anger and an awful lot of ferocious political attacks on Plaid Cymru as a result of what happened last week.
Nick Cervini, thank you very much for joining us. Joining me now to discuss today's news, we have the journalist Penny Taylor. And also Stephen Naismith, the social affairs correspondent of the Herald. Good evening to both of you. Thanks so much for joining me. Let's just pick up with the discussion we're just having. Penny, what did you make of the two opposing sides here when it comes to the offensive behaviour issue? The opposition parties really rounding maybe on the SNP in this one.
Well, I mean, it's quite literally a political football, isn't it? I mean, I suspect that, you know, this is the opposition parties flexing their muscle early doors to show that they actually have some power in this new parliament. But it was interesting to hear Patrick Harvie indicate that he wasn't necessarily for repealing that law, but for changing it and keeping the principles in place. So maybe it isn't quite so easy to have it overturned.
It might, Stephen, it might come to principles and political principles.
Yeah, I think there are two issues here. One is whether they've got the numbers to kind of beat the SNP, which plainly together now the other opposition parties have, but also whether they want to. And we know Labour, for instance, paid a hugely high price for appearing to side with the Tories in the independence referendum. Will they want to go through the lobby with the Tories again? And even if they are all that managed to agree on this issue of the Offensive Behaviour Act, I don't think you're going to see that too often, that all the parties will have the same view and be able to give Nicola Sturgeon a huge amount of problems.
And Penny, inside the political realm and outside the political realm, I suppose there is still a very strong, powerful debate about what to do to tackle sectarianism.
Yeah, and I think it sounds to me like there's a consensus that there's work needs doing to address that. And really the question is, does that involve repealing the bill or not? I do think that there is a concern that if you were to repeal that bill, what does that say about sectarianism in football? I know personally, when I first came to live in Glasgow, I had never heard the kinds of abuse that gets slung by both sides at one another. You know, it is an issue, I think, particularly for the west coast of Scotland, and it does need dealing with.
Right, now let's turn to another issue today. Of course, we've got Donald Trump making the news once again, speaking to Piers Morgan.
David Cameron has refused to retract what he said about your comments about Muslims. He says they were stupid, they were divisive, and they were wrong. What's your response?
Honestly, I don't care. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's fine.
But if you're president and he's the British Prime Minister...
It looks like we're not going to have a very good relationship. Who knows? I hope to have a good relationship with him. But it sounds like he's not willing to address the problem either.
Stephen, this could be interesting. If Mr. Trump does become president, he won't have a very good relationship with Mr. Cameron.
Well, the thing about it is he's not going to have a good relationship with quite a few people. The Hillary Clinton's team released an advert which was entirely made up of negative quotes about Donald Trump from his own party. People calling him a race-baiting, xenophobic bigot, a relentless narcissist, utterly amoral, completely unfit to be commander-in-chief. He's got enough problems within his own party without holding grudges, I think, about what other world leaders have said about him. And of course, it's not just David Cameron, the Pope, Benjamin Netanyahu, the President of Turkey. There's a whole load of people who have said things that they may come to regret about Donald Trump.
And Penny, David Cameron stands by his criticism.
Well, yes, and you know, it's a terrifying prospect, I think, for a great many people that Donald Trump might end up president of the United States. And of course, people are talking about the special relationship and, you know, does it threaten it? Well, you know, if somebody is going to be the kind of loose cannon that he could be as a president, you've got to say what you think about him. Yeah, you've just got to take a stand.
It'll be fascinating to see what happens, won't it, Stephen?
Well, it is, because I think there's probably no doubt that most people didn't think he would get this far. And if you ask David Cameron now, would he say? I mean, he has to defend his comments now, and it's not really surprising that he's sticking by them. But would he have said them if he had really thought Donald Trump had a realistic prospect of being the candidate? I think not.
Let's just move to our final story. Of course, a judge now in Peru has granted an order expelling the Scottish drugs mule Melissa Reid from the country. Now, the 22-year-old from Lenzie and, of course, Michelle McCollum from County Tyrone, they were jailed in 2013 for attempting to smuggle cocaine to Spain. Penny, perhaps an end to a long and difficult story here.
Well, it might be an end to the story, but it won't be an end to the experience of those young women. You know, they've served a third of their sentence, and under Peruvian law, Melissa Reid can now ask to be kicked out of the country and sent home. That doesn't mean that she serves the rest of her sentence here. She goes home. But I think the legacy of what she did will affect her family. I mean, I think her family has described it as horrendous, the impact on them.
Penny, Stephen, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much. We've run out of time. We have run out of time just now. Now, if you missed the BBC Scotland investigation, Britain's Puppy Dealers Exposed, it's available to catch again on the iPlayer. And tomorrow, I'll be back here on BBC Two Scotland with a special programme on the election of the First Minister. That's tomorrow afternoon. Bye-bye for now.